good morning, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well on this sunny morning. And welcome to the Artists Roundtable, which is part of the Curatorial Practice program at SVA here in New York. This program complements the Curatorial Roundtable run by Stephen Madoff, during which he invites esteemed curators from across the globe to share their experience and knowledge. Here we're looking at the work of an international range of distinguished artists who are making some of the most relevant and thought-provoking work today, inviting them to talk about the evolution of their work, their current focus and their current projects, and also how curating has played a role in their practice, either or both as being curated themselves by and their relationships with curators, but also how it relates to their artistic practice as curators, if some of their projects have worked that way. So today I'm really thrilled that the brilliant Naeem Mohaiemen is joining us right here in New York City. Welcome, Naeem, and thank you for spending time with us today. Naeem was born in London, UK, grew up in Dhaka in Bangladesh, and currently lives and works here in New York. He works in film, photography, drawing, writes essays, forms of utopia, dystopia within families, borders, architecture, and uprisings beginning in South Asia that radiated transnationally after 1945 are all focuses of his work. He's the co-editor with Eszter Szakacs of Solidarity Must Be Defended, the author of Bengal Photography's Reality Quest in Bengali, Midnight's Third Child, and Prisoners of Shothik Itihash. He's the head of photography concentration and the director of undergraduate studies in the Visual Arts Department, School of Arts, Columbia University. And I just wanted to say a key work that I remember seeing that made a huge impression on me and received huge acclaim was Two Meetings and a Funeral, commissioned by Documenta 14, and also which was co-commissioned by the Sharjah Art Foundation and Ford Foundation. And I also saw it as part of Liverpool Biennial, and a really brilliant presentation there. But the final thing I wanted to say is that if you do have a chance to see his current project, Through a Mirror Darkly, presented by Art Angel London, which explores the role of memorials as a focal point for individual and collective grief, focusing on the Kent State shootings, is an amazing work, which I was watching just a few days ago. It's also going to be presented at the Wexner Centre, and I think it's touring into a couple of other places. So I do recommend going to the Art Angel website, where you can also see Naeem talking about the evolution of that work. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Naeem, and he's going to talk to us about a few other projects of his, and I think it'll be an amazing conversation. Thanks, Naeem.
Thank you, Tamsin, for the introduction, and thank you to all out there who are joining in at this quite early hour of 9 a.m. for a webinar. Tamsin, I know you said you'd handed it over, but I hope you'll stay and every now and then interject, because I might forget to include crucial details that maybe are sort of second nature to me, but somebody in the audience might be trying to write it down and saying, what was that reference? So please do slow me down as needed.
And on that point, at around 10 to 10, we'll open it up for some questions. And if you do have questions, you can't put them in the chat, please do put them in the Q&A, and I'll be keeping an eye there. So we'll kind of read those out at that point. So thanks, Naeem.
Absolutely. And yeah, please do let me know when we're coming to the time for the questions. I was at Arte East's benefit yesterday, their annual benefit, and met someone who may or may not be on the webinar now, but they mentioned they knew about the webinar and then said, do you remember me? And I didn't. I was looking at them, and also crowded event, and they said, oh, I was the hand that peeled the oranges for this project you did in Vietnam. And it took a few seconds to figure out what they were talking about. And they were talking about 2006 Flying Circus. This project used to travel Vietnam, Singapore, bringing Asian artists together. And this is when I was living full-time in Bangladesh. I lived there again for 5 years and actually came back in 2011 to New York just on the cusp of Occupy Wall Street. And then after that went to grad school, partially because of experiences at Occupy Wall Street. And of course, as one does, last night I tried to find the video they were talking about. I think it was called something like Our Revolutionary Sweetheart. And it was just a video of somebody peeling oranges. And then there's a narration by me. And of course, it's not online. The Flying Circus, some things are archived, but many things are not. So this moment of Asian artist interactions, my first time in Singapore, my first time in Vietnam, first time with that many South and Southeast Asian artists together in a non-Western art environment. It's a vital experience, but also at that time in 2005-06, new for me, isn't archived. So I remember thinking last night, it's not archived. I mean, of course, somewhere in the depths of the internet might be buried, but I could not find it yesterday. So it's not archived. So in some ways, it doesn't exist. It never happened. Which is something that I think about a lot in terms of a lot of things that we worked on, especially the years before 2001. And I'll mention in a second why I'm kind of centering 2001 as a pivot year, really, a watershed year, a milestone year, a year that started so many things whose consequences we are living within today. But much of that work from about, let's say, I arrived in New York in 94 to 2001, and even 2002 till 2008 isn't archived in the same way because, 2007-08 is when social media, Facebook first opens to a wider public. It's the beginning of auto self-archiving, right? Where everything you do is stored somewhere, whether you have access to it or not. And a lot of this work is before, and I've just been thinking about what it means when you don't have the archive, and almost the events didn't happen. And so in that spirit, I was today going to talk about what was my first museum project, my first project as part of a collective that called themselves by the name Collective, and then Art Collective. My first experience of being curated, and really my first experience of ever thinking of the museum as somewhere to do work. Prior to that, I and many others were quite thoroughly outside the museum. We might go there, but we didn't ever think it was a space to do or make work or to engage, or that it was a space for us to have our conversations. And because the archive is uneven, I will go back and forth between a few slides I have, and then I will have to jump to the internet. And besides the fact that this was starting from 2003, 2004, my first experience of the museum as a space, I also wanted to center this time because Mustafa Bayoumi just wrote a piece in The Guardian about, there are many such articles, the meaning of Zohran Mamdani's, almost, I think, inevitable victory today, unless there is cheating, frankly. And he's written a piece about it, and I was talking to him about this, and I said, in 2002, if somebody said to me, or even in October 2001, that one day there will be a mayoral candidate who will be this close to victory or on the cusp of victory with the name Zohran Kwame Mamdani, Indian Ugandan heritage, very visibly not only a socialist but also Muslim, with his particular political positions, most people's brains would crack at that, what would seem like science fiction in 2001. And I think for those who hadn't come of age in 2001, it's almost impossible to project what that period was, or what kind of, the utter rollback of all civil rights for one community and the othering, the environment of suspicion and security panic that we lived under, really. From there to here is a quite extraordinary journey. And I'm not, there's that famous Barack Obama phrase about the arc of justice, or arc of whatever it is, which sometimes is really hard to believe because it seems we do live in pendulum swing of one maybe visible progressive gain and then a hard right swing. there is also some sort of arc going on here, and I center it within what happened after 9/11, and that's the root of this project. So let me share some slides. This is just a slide I'm going to come back to later, but it's a slide we had made about our artist collective called the Visible Collective, which operated from essentially 2003-4 till 2008. And we came together as a collective specifically because of a curatorial invitation. And this was a slide we started showing very soon within the project called the Privilege Matrix. And the Privilege Matrix here was where people were born. And you can see the top layer is people born in the US, starting from New York, ending up in Fargo, North Dakota. Second layer is people born elsewhere, but who had become US citizens. Calcutta, Delhi, Nairobi, Stockholm. And the third group are people born elsewhere, within which I am, who at that point had just received their green cards. And we talked about it as a privilege matrix because we were a collective representing a certain kind of immigrant, South Asian, perhaps Muslim, perhaps not, experience of America after 9/11. But we ourselves had relative privilege. We had citizenship privilege as we talked about it. And I'll talk about that more in a second. So I was in Facebook today, as one is, and I was trying to find material from 9/11, from all the protest rallies we went to, all the things that I documented after 9/11, around this phrase, our grief is not a cry for war. The ways that we would even, for example, center in that time the fact that there were a number of mainly Bangladeshi Muslims who had also died in the towers. Around this maybe somewhat naive slogan of Muslims died in the towers too, therefore this argument of not racial scapegoating Muslim American communities. And I can't, through words, by the way, Tamsin, express what the environment was like, what kind of fear environment was everywhere in this city, what level of othering, what level of lack of safety for not just Muslim Americans, but anyone presumed to be Muslim American. Tahir Naqvi, who's an academic in Texas, once famously said, Muslim is just a container into which you can project all your fears, and it's a way of ethnicizing. And the poet Shame Ali Naeem said to me once, Islamophobes don't care how pious you are. They don't even actually care if you're Muslim. It's like a container for the immigrant that is not welcome, etc. So I was going through the archives, and there isn't much even on social media. And I found this image. I'm just putting it out there just for a second. This is a fishing trip we had gone on 3 days before 9/11. And it's the only thing that's actually up on my social media that's related to that period. And not to make too much of the image, but this is a very polyglot New York gathering of 2001 September with absolutely no idea what is about to hit us in terms of what happens in the aftermath of the collapse of the towers. And then I found one more image, and I apologize, they're just images of me, but that's what I could find on social media, which is taken by Priyanka Dasgupta, who now is a professor at NYU. And she didn't know me at the time, but this is how we would know each other. This is how we would indicate, I see you. South Asian Americans or South Asian immigrants in New York who had never met each other and who would seek out the other South Asian faces in a crowd so we would feel safe. And at one of the many rallies protesting post 9/11 racial scapegoating, she had photographed me. And that's kind of all I could find in terms of the archive. I have a analog camera at the time. I even remember the strap. The camera's long gone. The photographs I took, the hundreds, if not thousands of photographs that we were taking at rallies, they're all gone. This moment of trying to organize against security panic and racial profiling is all gone. So because I couldn't find those elements in the archive, I thought I would show something else just to give a little sense of the energy. This, of course, is not the subterranean energy. The subterranean energy is the passenger who gets into the taxi and then starts berating the driver because they have presumed that they're from wherever they think people are from. That's the subterranean narrative of fear all throughout the city at the time. This is the above ground narrative, which is magazine covers, which are really not even the most harsh face of Islamophobia or anti-immigrant scapegoating, but it gives you a sense of the energy even on newsstands. And this is, by the way, at a time when people read magazines, people view magazines. So this was the Newsweek magazine cover that first week, extra edition. This is the New York magazine cover, People magazine, Time magazine, New Republic. It uses that famous line, "It happened here," from the title, "It Couldn't Happen Here." So now this is merging Islamophobia and the attack from outside with the Red Scare, because "It Couldn't Happen Here" is also from the Red Scare post-fascist period. And the Sports Illustrated was the one magazine that did not use a picture of the towers and instead used this, the empty seats and the flag. And of course, the week after, George W. Bush triumphant. People probably won't even remember this. It's lost in the midst of time. George W. Bush, who today is a Sunday painter, made quite sweet paintings. At that time was the architect of two wars that failed and created devastation all across the world, whose consequences we live in today. Every new war that breaks out is sitting on the skeletons of those two failed wars and what they set into consequence. But George W. Bush, elected from a highly contested election, the first time in recent memory where election is decided by the courts. If people might remember this thing, the hanging chads, which were the parts of the ballot that hadn't punched out and were there for hanging, and so you couldn't tell who someone had voted for. A famous moment of questioning the elections, and he had come out of that, right? He had come out from a highly disputed election, and 9/11 really became the way he became who he was, the national leader. So therefore, one nation indivisible, permission for war. This, "in the shadow of no towers," is a phrase I've borrowed from Art Spiegelman. He, who's the author of Maus, the graphic novel history of the Holocaust, Pulitzer winning, the first graphic novel, aka comic book, to win the Pulitzer. And he is one of the very few voices from the liberal intellectual establishment that as early as 2002 said, "No, but our grief is not a cry for war." And he wrote this extraordinary short graphic novel book called "In the Shadow of No Towers." The Twin Towers are now gone. And it's a very forceful denunciation of a tragedy being instrumentalized for war. And I use that phrase to talk about another magazine that I follow a lot, which is the New Yorker, right, who always uses illustrations, never photographs. And these are some of their covers over that period, which very much centered the Twin Towers as a central part of American and New York landscape, that which had disappeared. This is a memorial for the fallen. Halloween that year, where everybody is dressed as either a fireman or a policeman, because those were the two communities that perished while rushing into the towers. This is a very revealing photograph, actually. It's a taxi driver with a turban and a beard with "God Bless America" and something like 100 flags, because at that time, the flag was also needed to protect yourself. If you're an immigrant, you had to wrap yourself in the flag in order to pronounce loyalty, and you had to hyper perform if you were an immigrant of the visual landscape who would be racially profiled. Then this is Bin Laden and his crew in the mountains of wherever on Segways, which were a big popular item at the time. So the New Yorker allowing itself a little bit of humor. This is December 2001. September 2002, no towers in the skyline. March 2003, this is a very famous cover that the New Yorker got a lot of flack for, actually. It's basically Bin Laden in camouflage, looking at the New York City subway, trying to figure out how to get downtown, and blasé New Yorkers are just ignoring him. But part of the point was that people did say, who is the Bin Laden you're imagining? You're imagining every immigrant on the subway with a beard is basically a closet Bin Laden. So the New Yorker, of course, never apologizes for their covers, but they did receive some pushback. It's March 2003. You can tell it's 2003 because nobody has an iPhone in their hands. It's either newspapers or sleeping. September 2003, the reflections, and everything is doubled up. 2 Empire State Buildings, 2 Chrysler Towers, etc., but no Twin Towers. A window washer sketching the Twin Towers on a window through his cleaning swipe. This is 2004. 2004 December, the return of bin Laden, this time as Father Christmas. 2011, 10 years later, the towers reflected on water. 2006 is going back in time. This is Man on Wire, the film that came out about the daredevil who crossed between the towers. And it became a bit of a cause célèbre because it was a way of remembering the towers. Again, the towers are everywhere in discourse. And the absence of the towers also reinforces those who have taken the towers away from us. This is a remake of Man on Wire. Man on Wire was a documentary about the man who crossed between the towers. The Walk is a fictional recreation. And then 2011, after a failed war, these are the headlines. They're more muted, 10 years on, resilience, and beyond 9/11, very important, this moment in the discourse. And then 2020, this is the morning of 9/11, 2020 during the pandemic. And these are the covers. This is September 11th. And there's actually no mention of 9/11 on the upper end of the newspapers because there are much bigger worries at that time. This is when work from home has just started, and of course, the return of wildlife because of the pandemic. Part of my point is that, here, 20 years later, there isn't any mention of 9/11 anymore. This is the book that was very important for me, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, Chris Hedges, who talked about the fact that the US economy, in order to function, always needs new wars. The economy is so tied to military industrial production that if there isn't a war or if there isn't a country to which to sell weapons, large parts of the economy would start cracking apart. And it was the phrase we used for an exhibition I curated. Tamsin referred to my experiences as a curator, which are relatively brief, but I curated a show in 2007 called System Error with the subtitle War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. And we were, of course, being ironic, and so was Chris Hedges. Okay, so I want to transition from that to talking about this first project, which is probably what I'll just stay on today. And I spent a little bit of time giving a sense of the environment to sketch out a city paralyzed by fear, a city deep in the throes of othering, suspicious glances at everybody, a whole community shaped by being made to feel othered. And one of the instruments of liberal discourse was to talk about all the other times this has happened. So people would point out the scapegoating of Italians after the anarchist events of early 1910s or 20s. People would talk about the continuous othering, racial profiling of Jewish Americans throughout the early part of the 20th century. People would invoke the internment of Japanese Americans, the forcing of indigenous families to split their children and have their children in foster homes by forced care, racialization of Chinese Americans. We would do this too. We would do lectures. I was primarily thinking of myself as an activist who worked in South Asian cultural spaces, but we didn't use those words. We didn't say a phrase like cultural spaces. We just said we are activists and we try to organize to prevent racial profiling. So in those things, we would put up this picture that came out in an American magazine during World War II, which had a picture of a Chinese American person and a Japanese American person. And I don't have the image with me right now, but it's quite extraordinary. The diagram shows differences in the physiognomy, differences in the nose, the eyes, the eyebrows, the forehead, the hair, to say how to tell apart a Chinese American from a Japanese American, which during World War II, the idea is the Chinese are our allies. So if you meet a Chinese American person in San Francisco, leave them alone. But if it's a Japanese American person, or Jap as it was called, and by the way, Chinese Americans were called Chink, so neither of them had a flattering name. Both of them were racially profiled. But part of the point of the discourse was the Chinese are our allies, so don't scapegoat those, but scapegoat Japanese Americans. We would show those images. We would show the famous image, the sign that would say, no Irish, no blacks, no dogs. It's an iconic photograph. We would show images of the civil rights movement to kind of lean into this discourse, which is comforting, which is part of liberal discourse, which is part of Barack Obama's, arc of arc of progress or arc of justice always leans towards the positive. That once upon a time, this community was racially scapegoated. It's happening to us, but we are going to get past this as well, right? And so, for example, for the Muslim American community, or presumed Muslim, by the way, because it has to be said that those understood to be Muslim didn't even have to be from the faith. You just had to be from parts of the world that you were presumed to be from there. We would look at the experience of the Jewish American experience and say, okay, we will get past this as well. But it wasn't really a comfort. You could say all that. You could say, oh, once upon a time, Japanese Americans were incarcerated and, America later had to apologize. It did not feel any comfort in 2001, 2002, 2003 when you were hearing about racial attacks, cars being driven into stores, fire bombings, all of that. None of the historical arc of America and other countries. Another method would be, oh, look, it's happening in India, it's happening in Sweden, wherever. None of that would actually give you comfort in that moment. And I think, Zoran Mamdani and his generation, he's about a decade and a half younger than me. We were already fully formed during 9/11. We had already finished college and were out there. So in some ways, I feel like we were more brittle. We couldn't adapt quite so easily. We were more stunned by what was happening in this place, which was for some of us our adopted. I think Zoran Mamdani's generation came of age in that time and came up with a very different orientation of we are going to make sure we enter the American conversation fully. And they did. And I really think today's mayoral election, which really is influencing me a lot today as I speak on the cusp, I think, of something extraordinary, is really the fulfillment of that arc. And for us, we're already in our 20s, it was a different kind of survival headspace. And from 2001 September to 2004, I was involved in, and many people were involved in these organizations, Samar, which was South Asian Magazine for Action and Reflection, Third Eye, which was a South Asian film festival programming, Mutiny, Asian Underground, which was a club night, which tried to really bring people together through music and then to organize politics from there. And then Youth Solidarity Summer. I was less involved in that, but other people were, YSS, which was housed at this space called the Brecht Forum. Brecht Forum isn't around anymore, but parts of it have maybe transformed into the People's Forum. People like Vijay Prashad were very present at that time, who today runs Tricontinental. These are the leaders of the community at that time. We were doing all this, but we did constantly have this wall, which is that the newspapers, starting from the New York Times, going all the way to whoever else, New York Post, Daily News, even the Village Voice, were just an impenetrable space for us. The newspapers we could not enter, television we could not enter, radio, back when radio was actually one of the three most important mediums in any society, we couldn't enter. So it felt like, or it was very much, that our discourse against security panic, against surveillance, against racial profiling was being heard by people like us, who already believed, and liberals who believed in our cause, Art Spiegelman perhaps, but not all the other people who needed to hear it. And there was just no space. And this exhibition really was quite transformative for us because of what it opened up, what possibilities it opened up. And the roots of this project at the Queen's Museum actually bear talking about a little bit. I don't want to get to that picture yet. I'll come back to it later. Let me go to this picture. Yes, this is also from the outside. So the Queen's Museum of Art, for anyone who has been to it or hasn't been to it yet, is housed in Queens. It's a good 10-minute walk from the subway, so slightly outside the grid of where it's easy to get to, which, in New York City matters, is a site of many things. It was originally built as part of World's Fair related conversations. But one of the ways it's very important for many of us is that it was a site of the United Nations before the UN building was completed. And the vote and discussion for the partition of Palestine happened in this building. So it's quite imbricated in contemporary history in all sorts of ways. It's not just a museum, it's a museum that holds a whole history. And then, of course, the museum and sites around it was the site of the 1964 World's Fair, about which I've made a film last year, which was this moment of also we will unite the world through trade. And the best way to do that is to have all the world's businesses or companies show up at this site and show everything they have. This unisphere that you see reflected in the glass facade of the Queen's Museum is a remnant of the 1964 World's Fair. So the site is very important and very overlooked often because of its location. It's not part of the Guggenheim, Whitney, New Museum, MoMA, Met, this constellation of various museums that are all centered in Manhattan. Even Brooklyn Museum is in some ways more centrally located. So some ways Queen's Museum being a little bit outside of certain typical travel paths, you can do more because it's a little bit out of sight and you can be more experimental in some ways there. And the roots of our engagement with this museum is that in 2003, I think, this exhibition was brought to Queen's Museum called Edge of Desire, Contemporary Art in India. And it was the second in a series. The first one had happened a few years before that. This was the second, and then there was a third one. And it was very much in that model of country survey show, funded by philanthropists and businesses from that country, which in 2003-04, India's philanthropy and business community was much smaller than what it is today. But still, they had managed to bring this exhibition to the Queen's Museum, and it was going to be all across the Queen's Museum. And Prerna Reddy on the left, and Jayashree Abhichandani on the right, who now goes by the name Pyari Azadi. Prerna Reddy is a curator and programmer. Jayashree Abhichandani is an artist who became a curator in this moment, an organizer, and then now again has focused on our artwork under her new name or current name of Pyari Azadi. Prerna Reddy and Jayashree Abhichandani were part of the staff at Queen's Museum, and they were the two South Asian programmers. And they raised the issue of you cannot now, with everything the city is going through after 9/11, have an exhibition that's about Indian art in India. You have to do a pan-South Asian show that brings in India, Bangladesh, Pakistan as the three communities most affected, as well as the Arab community, of course, Arab American community after 9/11. And people who work on curating and work on exhibitions, you'll also resonate with this part. The organizers or the funders of the India show said, no, this is the India show. It's not going to become an India, Bangladesh, Pakistan show. The idea of three countries, Midnight's Three Children, uniting even under the umbrella of an exhibition ran against a certain kind of nation-state-based programming. It's the India show. It's not the South Asia show. But the response, which is why this image is of this hallway, this staircase going from one floor to another of the Queen's Museum, is here. Essentially, Tom Finkelpearl, who's the director of the Queen's Museum at the time, said to Prerna and Jayashree, okay, you can do something upstairs if you want to. You can do the South Asian show upstairs, South Asian American show. And let me show upstairs. This is the upstairs. At least this was the upstairs at the time. Queen's Museum has gone through remodeling. And upstairs was kind of this space for like educational programming. It was an in-between space. There were these windows that you didn't have access to, etc. So in some ways, it wasn't the space for official shows. Official shows always had to be downstairs. And this was what was given. And I'm spending a little bit of time on this to kind of map out something that happened in that moment. We did not think of ourselves as artists. We did not think of ourselves as showing in a museum. We did activism in magazines and books and radio shows and on the streets. And this invitation from a museum to propose something was sort of very puzzling. We're like, what is this about? What will we do in a museum? Okay, maybe we'll show some films. We were walking around with them and, everything here is like what was the Queen's Museum's own exhibit. These are actually, I found these graphics and I thought I'd put them in. These graphics are so Web 1.0 in terms of just little green blobs. This is way before SketchUp or all of that stuff. You can see how each of the spaces this is Ibrahim Quraishi, who was my partner on this project. And then eventually we became this collective. this was a time also 2004 where technology was like rising as a new thing. The iPhone or the iPod, sorry, not even iPhone, it was pre-iPhone. This was iPod only. The iPod was a new thing and you proposed it as something to do, tower structure. Some of this stuff, some of these designs are sweetly dated, which is why I kept them. Anyway, part of my point is that's Anjali Malhotra in the background. She works now in television on the West Coast. We were all in our 20s at the time, so all of us are something else now. We responded to this invitation and we formed a collective of 10 people to put together this exhibition. And the exhibition itself, which is called Fatal Love, was the introduction of, if I don't have the number incorrect, 22 artists of South Asian heritage, Bangladeshi, Pakistani, Indian, from the US, from Canada, from England, who, other than Shazia Sikandar and Reena Banerjee and Chitra Ganesh and Iftikhar Dadi, didn't have that much of a presence or engagement with contemporary art. I mean, we didn't at all. We positioned ourselves as lawyers and activists. And this, Tamsin, you had said, what does the act of curating do? Curating in this case formed us as a collective. The curators are tremendously energetic. They say, what about this? What about that? We start. I mean, you can see here in this diagram, I didn't even know how to make a green block stick against the window. So it's meant to be translucent images of detainees in various black sites mounted against the wall. I didn't even know how to do a graphic. That was just so, we were so new to this whole space of even proposing a visual project. But I say all this to say that, it's one of those things where you get an invitation and you form around it. And first you're two people. So like I said, there were 22 people 22 artists in the show, but Ibrahim and I were a pair. And then we said, okay, we can't be a pair. We're bringing in so many other people. This is Praran Joshi actually pretending to smash our install. They did not smash it. Vivek Bald here is like a young musician at the time. Today he's a professor at MIT and the author of Bengali Harlem. We were just starting out. Many of us hadn't even gone to graduate school. We didn't quite know what to do or what our engagement was. And the thing that happened, it's a triangular motion, right? The curators make a prompt. You say, okay, the Contemporary Museum, this seems to be an interesting space. You enter the space and you go, okay, this is going to be a one-time. I really thought it's a one-time thing. We're going to go back to organizing rallies outside. It was still called the INS, outside the INS building. And then the thing that happens then is the media, which is quite unexpected because this is one of the things that happened. This is only a selection, but essentially what happened was that the New York Times sent their reporter to report on the India show, right, which is the taking a magical flight through modern India by Holland Cotter, a name many of you will recognize. But the critics focused on us upstairs because they felt that, oh, this is actually something very relevant because right now we're in the middle of the 9/11 crisis. And so the critical response made us think, oh, we need to continue. And I'll just give one example of how the media also shapes moments. Holland Cotter wrote a second piece in March 2005 called The New Bridge and Tunnel Crowd. Bridge and Tunnel used to be the derogatory term for New Jersey or anyone coming in from outside of Manhattan. And it'll tell you the time. 2005, Long Island City was considered a new neighborhood. And it was talking about basically 5 neighborhoods: South Bronx, Jersey City, Red Hook, Long Island City, and Queens. And we were basically identified as Queens artists. And most of us didn't even live in Queens. And so you have this moment where you thought it's a temporary provocation. You say, okay, there's 2 of us, but now there's 9 of us. We can't really have all those names on the wall. So let's give ourselves a name. We'll call ourselves a collective. When you name yourself a collective, we were called Visible Collective, to make visible those who have been rendered invisible through detention and racial scapegoating. When you name yourself a collective, you take on a a solidness that perhaps you didn't have before. Perhaps you thought this is just this month. But the naming gives you a form that also gives those looking for the signs of movements, of resistance, of organizing, of cohesion, something to also touch and say, this is something solid that's granulating right now. And so they would reach out to us and say, we heard you have a collective. We are doing an exhibition on art collectives. And we said, well, we've been a collective for about 2 months. Said, okay, but would you like to do more? And then you start leaning into this. And 2005, kind of an extraordinary year. I can only say it was not really so much about our work. It was so much about the fact that people were looking for something. They were looking for signs of hope. They were looking for signs of resistance. The previous Whitney Biennial, which was in 2004, Whitney Biennial of American Art, had received scathing responses from some critics to say America is engaged in 2 wars overseas. The press at that time did not say illegitimate wars. They just said wars, right? So even the New York Times supported the war in all sorts of ways. Important thing to remember when you read the New York Times today. So people wouldn't say unjust wars, but they would say America is engaged in 2 wars overseas, and the Whitney Biennial of American Art 2004 edition doesn't have a single work referencing that. So the art establishment also started to understand that they were not taking the role they should have taken, which also the newspapers and television and radio are not taking. So there was I think, a desire from parts of contemporary art to also respond to the crisis with the US as the center that had engulfed the planet, really. And we are still living in the consequences of those 2 wars if you really draw a straight line from one moment to another. So then we started feeling as a collective I'm sorry, I've spoken so much and I haven't actually shown the work. I'll just show the website. You can go to the website and look at everything. It's called disappearedinamerica.org, sorry. And all our projects or some of our projects, the ones we could find the archive for, are listed here. I won't go through them right now. One of the reasons there's so many projects all the way up to 2011 is because we kept getting invited. And those invitations also had some things that made us feel a bit complicated. For example, a lot of the invitations would be from Scandinavia, Sweden, Germany axis, which we didn't understand at the time. We understand later there is a certain kind of axis of art funding that is public funding and that is able to take risks that American museums couldn't take at the time. But we also understood, and this was the complicated part of it, that sometimes when you're being invited to speak about the American crisis in Germany, you're speaking to the audience that is least able to make a difference. And then sometimes you can lean into this European comfort of, we are okay because look where they are. Okay, this is on Flash, that's why it won't work. I'm just showing some images very quickly, but again, everything's on the website, you can look at it. We started being uncomfortable about being invited to come and present in the Scandinavian, German, French funding axis because we were a project about what was happening in America. And at some point, some members of the collective said, okay, we were just doing this for 1 or 2 years. This is not going on. And some of us stayed. So I stayed. And after 2007, started working on solo projects. 2008 was the first time I worked outside the collective. So I've maybe collapsed a lot of history together very quickly. Maybe I'll just show that slide that I started with, which is what we called our privilege matrix. And part of our point with the privilege matrix was that everyone in the collective that is representing the collective and traveling, these were all the collectives, were either born in the US or born abroad and had become citizens, or born abroad and had become green card holders. That's me right there, the third box, and that's everybody else. And we did this chart to say that the most vulnerable people was everybody else. F, processing out of status. And by the way, in the discourse of 2004, you still said illegal. By 2005, the word became undocumented. I didn't revise it because I wanted to keep it as is. So we also started questioning our position as representing those most harmed by post 9/11 security panic, because we said, no, we're not the most vulnerable people. And it's very important to also recognize that. So maybe I'll pause there because I realize that I have already taken up 40 minutes of time, and there's a lot more to say, but maybe to sum up, to say that this collective, this engagement, this entrance really came about because of this very energetic two people who insisted that it could not be a India show downstairs, who said it had to be a South Asia show upstairs, and really set many things in motion. There are books like When Object Become Form, which talks about historic exhibitions, sometimes in Europe or North America. And when I look at books like those, I have said multiple times to various people, somebody should do a whole project around this exhibition, because it really set many people's arcs in motion. I'm only one of the people. There were many, many people. I'll just show this very quickly. I won't play this. This is a chart I had done for a 10-year look back at the exhibition. And I tried to do a matrix of, see in the center, this blue dot that says Fatal Love 2005. I tried to do a chart of all the people that were connected through the show and all the places they went. And this chart, which is very preliminary, it was meant to be crowdsourced and always added, extends to cities across the border all the way to South Asia, extends from universities to museums, to newspapers, to film festivals. And it was just a small glimmer of how many things got started, which is not to say that this exhibition is the beginning and ending. The exhibition is the entry point for all of us to understand how this happened. But I do think that post-2001, just as Mamdani's generation decided to go directly into politics, to law school, to become lawyers, and that generational quest, you see the results today on the cusp of the election. For all of us, it was I think, quite actively entering the space of contemporary art as a place where you could have these conversations that were being denied everywhere else. And all our journeys since then have come from that moment. So maybe I'll pause there. Tamsin, should I stop sharing so that we can be full screen, or I can keep showing some images while we take the questions?
That might be good. I don't see any questions in the Q&A. Oh, here we go.
Okay.
But I was just going to say, wow, what an amazing story that you've just told, and setting that context, especially with all the media coverage over 2001 and that series of New Yorkers covers. I'm assuming you kind of deliberately collected those and have them in some kind
of I collected the ones that were specifically about the Twin Towers or the absence of Twin Towers, or about the specter of Bin Laden on every New York City street. And by the way, the New Yorker is a liberal magazine. That's one of the good magazines, I mean, if I did a collection of New York Post covers, I don't even think we could put them up. They would break my laptop screen. Yeah.
But I had a kind of almost obvious question, but I'm just going to read this one out from SC. Thank you for sharing. Why do you think the Fatal Love show broke through the media discourse at the time? That's a really good question, actually.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mentioned that the Whitney Biennial the previous year had received criticism. And when I say receives criticism, though, this is before social media. So there wasn't a way that an individual could really express their discontent with that biennial. And it certainly wasn't in the mainstream discourse. So I think it was at a subterranean level, right? A dinner table conversation of, don't you think it's odd that the Whitney Biennial doesn't have anything about America to watch? So the discomfort was there. People like Holland Cotter, who is known as an art critic at the New York Times, but who actually his political formation is from being an activist with the Freedom Summer in Mississippi. Many people don't know that he came out of that and then came into art criticism and focused on, for example, African art very early on. These people all had the discomfort of what's happening, but they're art critics. They can't write about the crisis unless there is a work they can review. And there really hadn't been anything. Now, things were bubbling up and it takes time. So around 2004-05, there were few distinct strands that happened at the same time. We came up as a collective. Mariam Ghani and Chitra Ganesh also formed a collective from which they did a project called, I think, Atlas of the Disappeared, or a title like that. And they were at the same time as us. Then Trevor Paglan was working on his project to document Black sites, but it hadn't published yet, or it hadn't really broken through. So 9 or 10 or 12 or 15 or 20 small little initiatives. I think the reason that ours really got a particular kind of attention that in some ways Trevor's could not, is I think people were really looking for signs of resistance to racial profiling and overseas war that is coming from the community most directly affected. Right. So the front line of the anti-war movement, led by organizations like Answer, Act Now to Stop War and End Racism, which I think doesn't fully exist anymore, certainly not as powerful as it was then. The front line of that was not the term that even wasn't as common then was not people of color, the front leadership. It was generally a white liberal intelligentsia, some African American leadership. And there was this unease that the community most affected isn't the one in the press, isn't the one speaking. And of course, there are reasons. The community didn't feel safe. If a taxi driver has been pulled over to be arrested, he's also not going to go on radio and say, my name is Salim Javed and this happened to me. They will also further go underground. So there was a media that was looking but couldn't find the community most affected. And it isn't, for example, like today where a press can find micro communities through social media or some other methods within a few minutes or a few hours of digging. You also couldn't find the community unless you lived there. And so I think for the art press, an exhibition of 22 artists with South Asian heritage, majority of the works actually talking about 9/11, not just us, was quite extraordinary where they've been looking and they hadn't found one. So for example, I forget if her name is Asma Ahmed Shiko. People can look up. The full catalog of this exhibition is on the Asia Art Archive website. She had done a project which was a New York City subway map with every name changed into Urdu. And there was a discussion about making that the poster of the exhibition. And that Queen's Museum was like, no, we can't do that. We can't have this all. So there was that fear, by the way. You couldn't put an Urdu language subway map of New York City out anywhere because it would be they're taking us over. And of course, Urdu is Arabic, Arabic is Urdu. It's all one Maligatawny soup of languages people don't recognize. There was Iftikhar Dadi's project. There were other projects that took the map of out of the 22 artists, I think at least half or more were engaging directly with post 9/11 America. There was a Canadian artist who did this project where she was praying in public spaces and being photographed praying and people staring. Today, that would seem very much like a, MFA first semester project. But 2004, praying in a public space and provoking or daring to see, okay, let's see if you respond to this, was an extraordinary gesture. It isn't the New York City of 2025. So I think there was a way that it was also seen as, even though many of us, like it wasn't necessarily, but it was seen as the 9/11 affected community finally speaks back. And I say the media because Crane's Business News, which I did not know what it was at the time, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Time Out, Village Voice, okay, not so unexpected. All this media that doesn't usually cover a group show of 22 people of what today would be called maybe diaspora artists or hyphenated artists or American artists or whatever term you want to use. We were not so much the moment as the moment came to meet us, and we were interpellated. Like there was a hailing of us, and we turned and said, "Oh, It really was a unplanned serendipity moment of, we are doing this thing. We're not really sure what's happening here." And then you walk into the moment and you also go, "Oh, I see you. Who are you all? I see you in this room." I'll see if I can find a picture of the opening. It was quite extraordinary, just the feeling of all those people together.
And while Naeem is doing that, does anyone have any other questions? I can't believe there's only the one.
I might have explained too much and
one
overwhelm people with too much detail.
There's so much to think about, and just aside from this whole kind of political kind of aspect, but just the way that technology has played a huge role, and how something like this couldn't really, so many things came together for this to happen at that particular moment. And I was interested in the fact that you said you hadn't made any work outside of the collective until 2008. You mean
2000? Yeah, maybe that's not exactly correct, but I think I think I was doing small things. I think the difference was that when I was working on something related to Bangladesh, that wasn't of interest to the whole collective. So that I would definitely be solo. But I think 2007-8 was also a moment where we said, okay, the collective has done what it intended to do, and there are other people now working on this. Trevor Paglen was a very important intervention for us because by 2008 he had done projects documenting black sites and NSA, not NSA headquarters yet, I think, but he had done, and we're like, okay, this is someone who we definitely were aware that he had much more safety than us. Let that proceed. Let us now go back to other things. And for me, it was actually to go back and look at the 1970s as another period of global panic around
which
racial
is
food.
what your current work is kind of focusing on.
Current work is, yeah.
There is another question which kind of feels the same. Renee MG says, really interesting. I feel the trajectory of the work speaks to the power of the curators in contemporary spaces. What is the relationship like now? Could this happen now? Which is also an interesting thing to pose.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does happen all the time, but in different ways. I mentioned I spent a little bit of time talking about the Queen's Museum as being outside the grid. And Sally Talent at Queen's Museum might say, what are you talking about? We're at this very center. But what I mean is a physical grid, right? It's slightly challenging to get to. There's a Sophia Backstrom show right now, Great Society. I'm planning a student trip, but we have to plan, including the commute. So these things matter. But being slightly outside of certain sort of Manhattan-centric discourse meant you could do more experiments. There weren't so many eyes. And I think Tom Finkelpearl's decision to give 2 South Asian employees of the museum, who none of them had the term curator in their title. They were more public. I think Hitomi Iwasaki was there even then, but they were more like public programming. And it was like public programming that became this exhibition, that became this 22% exhibition, therefore took over the entire top floor and the windows, and then became more solid because of the media response. I think is a function of a time when there was a lot less noise, right? It's not a time when all 22 of us make our own little posts. Even the fact that we got a website done that year was because Anandu Roop Roy in our group, his day job was building websites, and that's why that happened. It wasn't at all typical to have a website. Could this happen now? I think it happens now, but in much more spread out, granular ways. And I think one thing that doesn't happen, can't happen, and maybe it's okay, is for one single exhibition to be also a coming together of so many people in the community. The South Asian community, the Muslim community, the immigrant community, seeing themselves in an exhibition. Today, maybe there are 40 such points of connecting. So there's not one individual connecting. Maybe coming back to the Zohran moment, that is some sort of coming together of many cultural and political forces around one moment. But I go to exhibitions all the time now that are curated by, South Asian heritage curators that I've not heard of, with artists that I've, there's so many more of those exhibitions. It's a more diffuse and fractured landscape. But I wouldn't say that our single unitary thing is what I'm nostalgic for also, because that was a lot of pressure on one exhibition and a set of 22 artists.
I mean, it also says something about public programming and its integration with the curating side of an institution and what's happening with that in different institutions.
I think public programming, and one thing I will say about discourse within contemporary art, even in 2004, it was the conversation with the curators that made us more aware of our position of privilege vis-a-vis citizenship, right? And the idea of making a citizenship matrix slide and making that the first slide every time we presented the project really came out of a contemporary art discourse of always restlessly analyzing yourself and your positionality. I think if we had shown at a film festival the same project, there would be more of a leaning into who you are as representing the people on stage. And I think a certain level of look in the mirror, challenge what you see, things are not what you think exactly, ambiguity, indeterminacy, and a restless curiosity and not being settled with the facts, that came to us from a contemporary art discourse, at least in 2004.
Well, thank you, Naeem. This was an amazing talk that I'm really thrilled to have invited you to make, and I hope everybody has enjoyed it. We're going to now close this talk down, and we'll go. Oh, there's one third question.
It's a note, I think, from
yeah.
Carla.
Thank you for this fascinating exploration of the history of your work into present time, especially on this momentous day.
Yes, just 12, 14 hours to go, hopefully.
Hours to go before we get those results.
Nervous and excited as a New Yorker.
Maybe we're going to continue this conversation with the students on the other link, which we'll go to now. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And we'll see you again at this time next week for the Artists Roundtable.
Thank you, everyone.